Could the pyramids be the remains of a single global engineering project older than any known civilization, built with a hidden purpose we have completely misunderstood? Across deserts and continents stand stones arranged with uncanny precision. Tomb, temple, or tool. Each theory fits a piece, but not the whole. What if those theories miss one radical truth that ties every pyramid together into a single story older than our history books claim? Stay until the final chapter. There we bring the one piece of evidence that could rewrite everything. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Map Before Maps. Tracing a hidden pattern. From the air, the world looks like a different planet. Deserts fold into patterns, river valleys etch silent ridges, and stones stand like punctuation marks in the landscape. A lone surveyor rides a small plane along a brittle coastline, watching points on the ground blink into existence like stars. He does not see tombs at first. He sees coordinates and angles. He draws lines on a napkin and then on a map and then on many maps, tracing a pale geometry that refuses to be random. Airborne images feed his notebooks. Every new frame offers a fresh alignment, an edge that seems to answer another edge, a slope that seems to reply to a slope far away. The view grows urgent. Each new line tightens the sense that something deliberate has been left behind, a map before maps that waits to be read. He pins faint threads to paper like a hunter making a trail to follow, careful and relentless. Back on the ground, the surveyor becomes a collector of small certainties. He gathers travel logs left in drawer chests, tales scrawled by fishermen on the margins of tide charts, and the faded itineraries of cartographers who once crossed these seas. He tapes coordinates beside sketches of stone platforms and adds notations on slope and azimuth, as if compiling a field language that did not yet exist in books. A particular latitude keeps recurring like a remembered melody. He marks it with a circle and then with a dot and then with a question. Merchants who visited these coasts wrote of strange mounds inland. Old pilgrims recorded straight paths under the sun. The surveyor stitches these fragments into patterns and begins to suspect that the film of human memory still holds an older cartography. He keeps the files in a box labeled simply evidence, and when the box is full, he cannot sleep. At dawn, he returns to the maps again. He lays transparent overlays over satellite images and watches improbable coincidences align into crisp angles. Lines drawn from the apex of one pyramid pass through the corners of another and slide out to sea as if following old shipping lanes. Bearings that should scatter randomly instead cluster around familiar rational fractions. The angles are not wild. They are patient and geometric, the kind of numbers chosen by minds who measure and remeasure. The surveyor begins to see an invisible lattice that ties continents together. He creates a grid and finds that distances between nodes often resolve into shared units, small whole measures repeated like a chorus. Where scholars saw isolated wonder, he sees junctions, a system of points and lines that could be plotted on a single surface. The discovery feels dangerous and thrilling at once, as if someone had left a secret blueprint across the skin of the earth. He photographs the pages and hides them from easy view. Field notes lead him to other researchers and to dusty volumes in libraries that smell of glue and sun. He traces measurements carved into blocks and compares them to dimensions recorded centuries ago. The slope of the Great Pyramid echoes in the profile of a stepped structure in a far valley across an ocean. The proportion of base to height repeats with small variations like dialects of the same language. Builders in separate zones choose similar ratios, favoring stability and visibility and perhaps something else no one has named. He writes the names of places in his ledger and arranges them on the floor of his workshop, so maps spill into room-sized diagrams. A graduate student with a fondness for odd hypotheses comes to help, and together they mark identical modules on stones that could hardly have spoken to each other. The pattern presses insistently toward something neither of them expected. At night they argue gently and then fall silent before dawn. They go into the field and measure with instruments that feel stubbornly modern and strangely ancient at once. Tape and laser, plumb bob and the slow patience of hands that know how long a day lasts by sight alone. Triangulation becomes a ritual. They mark sight lines from hilltop to hilltop, from ruined summit to ruined summit, and watch how shadows confirm or defy the drawn grid. Slope ratios that should vary wildly instead settle into narrow families of numbers. A module appears, a small unit that can multiply to create base lengths and partitioned inner chambers, as if a measuring system had been carried from place to place. Local masons recall older methods passed down by memory and gesture, not by book, and their rules match the findings of the surveyor. Each measured block feels like a letter, and each slope like a punctuation that hints at a shared grammar of construction. They catalog blocks and compare notes until the light fails. Old mariners' journals and customs ledgers begin to matter as much as stone. He finds records of cargoes that stop at ports on opposite sides of the ocean, timber and copper and oddly shaped blank tablets that no one had cataloged properly. Shipping manifests list craftsmen who traveled with caravans and ships, hired for short seasons to teach a geometry or to set a cornerstone. Where trade winds blew, ideas could ride with them, measuring rods and rules tucked into crates of traded goods. The narrative of isolated invention grows thinner when viewed beside these routes. An instrument noted in a 15th century account mirrors a device sketched in a coastal log much earlier. The surveyor imagines a seedboat crossing years, not just miles, carrying craft and codes. Each manifest that mentions a mason or a measure adds weight to a world more connected than textbooks have allowed. He photographs the ledger pages and sends copies to colleagues overseas quickly. Maps drawn before modern coastlines show inlets and capes that no longer exist. He studies paleo shorelines, the ghost edges where sea levels and sand shifted and old harbors dried. A route that seems absurd on modern charts would have been obvious on those earlier maps. Lines of travel that once hugged coasts link to river corridors that cut inland, offering a plausible pathway for ideas and materials. He overlays ancient maps on modern images and notices that many pyramid sites sit near those lost margins, at the places where sea met land in eras long gone. The pattern of nodes suggests a coastal logic to placement, a network of landing points and supply depots from which stones and knowledge could be ferried inland. The more he reconciles ancient maps with geology, the more the network reads like infrastructure rather than isolated aspiration. He imagines crews unloading measurement standards from shallow boats and carrying them like sacred cargo into deserts silently. On a dusty morning, a field team unearths a small stone marker lodged in packed earth beside a forgotten causeway. It is a simple object, unremarkable until photographs reveal incised marks that match marks found on a block 3,000 miles away. The marks are not decorative. They measure. They denote a counting system or a rule for cutting angles, a shorthand that could be read by those who knew it. The coincidence sends a ripple through the community of researchers. One team writes cautionary notes about contamination and later additions, while another team points to the same pattern in an archive drawing made centuries earlier. The marker becomes a hinge in the argument, a small tangible bridge between sites that should not have shared tools. It sits, cataloged and cataloged again, waiting for someone to translate its quiet language. Scholars debate provenance in hurried emails and late-night calls, and local guides tell stories of stones moved in storms. Obsession becomes a practical condition. The surveyor wakes before dawn and reads tide tables in the dark. He chases clerical notes across continents and inventories measurements as if counting breaths. Friends say he has changed, and perhaps he has. The search consumes small pleasures and replaces them with a hunger for pattern. Opponents emerge with force and precision. Established scholars point to context, to parallel invention, to the human habit of finding pattern where none exists. The surveyor respects their caution and yet cannot unsee the lines. His colleagues are fractured into those who will follow and those who will not. A young researcher asks if the search is arrogance or humility, and the surveyor answers with a map that refuses to lie down. The hunt deepens because the lines keep appearing in fresh places. Museum marginalia sometimes reveals ports and temple payments, brief notes that hint at craftsmen moving between coasts and building sites over long distances in antique. Back in labs, geologists test mortar samples and isotopes and sometimes find recipes that do not fit expected trade patterns. Remote sensing specialists run algorithms across pixels and extract linearities that evade casual eyes. When datasets are compared, the same module appears again and again, nested within structures that span centuries. A software run that was meant to check for erosion instead highlights angles that echo across hemispheres. The team builds a database and then a visualization that looks like an engineered constellation. Critics point to selection bias and to the seductive clarity of overlays. The team answers by publishing raw coordinates and methods and inviting replication. Young analysts reprocess the data and return with independent confirmations. The pattern keeps surviving scrutiny, not because everyone agrees, but because the anomalies persist even under the microscope of methodical testing. Late nights in the lab become a steady drumbeat of rechecking, of slow arithmetic that returns the same stubborn results again nightly. One alignment plays like a refrain through all their work. A line connects a cliff site to a river mouth and then to a desert plateau where a stepped complex stands in patient ruin. The same bearing names a sequence of stars in an ancient nautical log, and it corresponds to a trade route sketched on vellum that has been dismissed as decorative. The surveyor traces this line until it passes over a small island where an unexcavated mound sits marked only by lichen and rumor. He maps the coordinates and checks them twice. The line is too precise to be mere accident and too widespread to be local improvisation. It demands an explanation that reaches backward into time. He files a short report and then files another with coordinates highlighted in red. He knows this is the place where the map before maps begins to insist on being read. The island will be a question mark until final chapter. The work moves from maps into argument and then into urgency. Sponsors who once funded routine surveys now ask for proposals framed in bolder language. Museums permit sampling. Governments ask cautious questions. There is no consensus, only a growing set of facts that pushes the community toward reckoning. For some, the idea of a global building tradition threatens national narratives and the tidy timelines of textbooks. For others, the possibility opens new doors to understanding human ingenuity at scale. The surveyor knows that proof will require more than lines on paper and coincidences cataloged in notebooks. It will require artifacts, replicated measures, and a willingness to look at old maps with new eyes. The next chapter will follow those measures into the stones, into quarries, and into the hands that shaped them, because the map before maps demands that its story be tested. Chapter 2: Stone and Signature. Shared geometry across time. From the edge of a quarry, the world changes its tone. Hands that have worked stone for generations move with a memory older than names. Chisels sing against limestone and granite while the sun takes measure. A mason runs fingers along a freshly hewn face and announces a slope with a small, certain gesture. In workshops, the rule is practical and simple. A measure must be repeatable. Measurements become language, they become signature. The surveyor from the previous chapter arrives with maps and questions and watches these gestures like a student. He notices how masons count and mark, how small lines are cut at identical angles, how a repeated chord appears on blocks from different continents. The quarry keeps its secrets in tool marks and in the abandoned beds of stone where evidence sleeps. Under dust, the surveyor sees patterns that resemble handwriting more than architecture and realizes geometry is also a human footprint. That handwriting reaches across oceans quietly. He examines profiles in sunlit ruins and in shaded vaults, tracing the angles with a steady pen. The Great Pyramid's face is a plane that flattens into a simple ratio, a choice that balances sight and slope. In a jungle clearing, a stepped mound echoes that choice with its terraces, forming a scaled version of the same decision. Far to the east, a terraced monument uses a nearly identical rise over run when measured as a proportion, not as a crude coincidence. The surveyor writes down ratios and then compares them in a ledger like a detective comparing fingerprints. Small fractions recur, small integer relationships between height and base that appear more often than chance allows. He draws triangles and places them next to triangles from other sites, and the shapes fit like panels in a modular kit. This recurring geometry feels like a builder's signature, an index of intent and understanding across time and distance, demanding explanation beyond coincidence. Modules become a recurring obsession. A small unit of length appears in measurements taken in workshops and on site, a practical module that subdivides nicely into base lengths and chamber widths. It is not always the same absolute measurement because scales shift from place to place, but the ratios remain obedient. Masons adapt the unit to local stone, but they preserve the same fractional relationships that allow complex shapes to be assembled from repeated parts. In carved marks on blocks, the surveyor finds tally marks and tripled notches that may indicate repeatable measures rather than random graffiti. These modular habits save labor and avoid frequent recalculation, an economic instinct that could explain cultural spread without deliberate copying. Yet the same modules show up in sites that had no obvious contact, which complicates simple explanations. The evidence pushes toward a transmitted standard, a practical recipe for building that could travel with craftsmen and cargo alike. It suggests an organized craft tradition. The team measures corner angles and sees echoes of the same choices in distant places. Right angles are common, of course, but the specific way corners are chamfered, the tiny face left between larger blocks, recurs in patterns that resist cultural boundaries. In one layered complex, a chamfered edge sits at the same relative position as in a coastal platform 4,000 miles away. The surveyor photographs the joints and catalogs the mason's marks beside them, creating a database of construction quirks that reads like a shared playbook. Tool marks tell stories of technique as much as intent. The type of hammer, the rhythm of blows, and the sequence of dressing a block reveal taught processes. Comparative photographs show the same sequence of blows leaving identical microtraces across different stone types and climates. When the team overlays microphotographs, the traces line up with unnerving regularity. These microtraces function as a fingerprint, a technical signature transmitted by movement and habit alone. Geometry is not only shape but also proportion, and proportion can survive when absolute measures do not. A base twice as long as a height or a face set at a particular slope will read the same regardless of the stone's unit size. The surveyor draws ratios and sees the same proportional decisions across climate zones, across latitudes, and across millennia of rebuilding. In countryside workshops, elders recite rules of thumb that reduce complex problems to simple ratios, practical heuristics that any apprentice can memorize. The same heuristics appear where no direct contact has been proved, which forces the investigators to ask whether these rules were independently arrived at or taught. Repeated designs can come from shared constraints, but when the same instruction appears engraved in marginalia at one site and scratched into a block at another, coincidence strains credulity. The geometry begins to read less like decoration and more like a preserved and portable knowledge and like cultural DNA. Instruments matter. The surveyor finds references to rods, cords, and sighting devices tucked into shipping manifests and into marginal notes of treaties. A cord stretched between 2 points becomes a portable rule for setting slope and aligning corners. A rod with marks becomes a module carrier. Such instruments would make replication easy across distances. Teach the tool and the rule travels with it. He reconstructs a simple sighting frame and tests it against ruins, amazed to watch angles fall into the same families the maps predicted. The apparatus needs no literacy to function, only practice and repetition, which would explain its resilience across languages. Tool sketches found in temple graffiti mirror the reconstructed frames, and the surveyor takes photographs that match the measured results. An instrument becomes a bridge between sites, a material habit that can imprint a signature across continents. When craftsmen moved, they packed familiar tools. These tools taught local hands how to cut and join and measure. A single proportion haunts their ledger, a slope that balances visibility with structural safety and that appears repeatedly. It is a slope that gives the monument a particular profile, a silhouette visible from a distance and pleasing to a human eye attuned to certain angles. In one desert, the ratio corresponds to an angle that minimizes erosion in wind-driven sand. In a jungle climate, the same ratio channels rain in predictable ways, shedding water from weathered tiers. Engineers of different eras and places could choose similar solutions to similar problems, and yet the pattern's ubiquity suggests more than parallel thinking. When the team measures internal passages, they find the same proportional logic governing corridor width and chamber height, as if the internal spaces obeyed the same grammar as the exterior faces. The repeated slope becomes a motif that begins to read like an inherited answer to common architectural problems. It acts as a mnemonic device for builders and crews alike. Geometry leaves marks not only in finished form but in process. The order of steps matters. In workshops, the sequence of dressing, of leveling, of laying courses follows a rhythm that can be read when walls are peeled back. In several sites, the surveyor notes the same sequence: a foundation level to a unit, a first course set with an intentional offset, then a measuring frame used to divide the next tier. This procedural rhythm acts as a reproducible recipe, minimizing error and enabling crews with different languages to build compatible structures. The team documents mortar bedding techniques and finds matching bead patterns where courses meet. These are small things: the spacing of chutes for waste, the order of raising ramps, the occasional use of temporary wooden guides marked in the same system. Taken together, these processual details form an anatomy of construction common to distant workshops. It suggests crews shared measurements and choreography, a ritualized method passed between groups. Signature extends into decoration and orientation. The placement of doorways, the angle of causeways, and the orientation to cardinal points appear intentionally consistent at many nodes. In one valley, monuments face a river at precisely the same bearing as structures on a distant shore face the morning sun. This is not formal astrology but practical orientation, aligning sightlines with celestial and coastal markers useful for navigation and coordination. Orientation may encode information about routes, about seasons, and about where to position supplies and watchers. When paths align with astronomical risings, the structure may double as a waypoint and a calendar, a built device that communities could use for timing agricultural and navigational tasks. Across sites, the same orientation choices crop up, often linked with shared slope ratios and modules, producing a combined signature of orientation and proportion. This vocabulary would make structures interoperable across distant landscapes. Skeptics will point to convergent evolution, and the surveyor expects the rebuttal. Human minds confronted with similar problems will often find similar solutions, and good engineers converge on efficiency through trial. Yet convergence cannot easily explain identical micropractices. The same notch proportions, the same chamfer sequences, and the same marking systems tucked into masonry joints. When a mason in one region uses a marking system that matches marks on blocks thousands of miles away, coincidence becomes an insufficient answer. The team subjects these claims to statistical tests and to blind comparisons, inviting independent analysts to try to break the pattern. Some tests refute false positives. Other tests strengthen the case that a shared construction language persists. They publish methods and raw data, and they encourage replication so that the patterns either remain robust or dissolve under independent review in public forums. Stories help the facts travel. Oral tradition preserves procedures in metaphor and song, and sometimes a memory of a technique lies hidden in a nursery rhyme or a festival rite. The surveyor listens to elders who hum building rhythms and watch apprentices mark stones with thumb and eye. In some coastal communities, a festival reenacts the unloading of cargo in a way that preserves the order of tasks. These performative memories might encode measurements, seasonal cycles, or protocols for assembly. When recorded and compared with archaeological measures, they sometimes align, offering cultural context to the technical evidence. The team records these performances and treats them as data, not as quaint folklore, because they can reveal how technical knowledge persisted outside formal records. When craftsmen recite block sequences, they name ratios and anchors that echo the measurements found in ruins and catalogs worldwide often. By the chapter's close, the surveyor's ledger resembles a travelogue of geometry, pages filled with ratios, microtraces, and instrument marks. He points to matching slopes across deserts and jungles, to modular units nested inside base lengths, and to tool traces that align like repeated letters in a dispersed manuscript. This is not a claim that one empire built everywhere, nor a demand to rewrite every chronology in a single stroke. It is a narrower, more stubborn claim. Certain construction habits and measures recur with a frequency and specificity that suggest transmission. The team prepares to follow those traces into quarries, into mariner logs, and into workshops where instruments and methods were kept alive. An alignment in their ledger points at a remote island with an unexcavated mound, a place whose proof or disproof could sharpen the whole argument. The map before maps grows clearer, and the next chapter will probe the stones themselves to see whether geometry is a local craft or a shared signature. Chapter 3: The Seedboat, Seafaring, Trade, and the Spread of Ideas. Sea travel has always been a conversation between wind and hull, a slow argument of skill and patience. Imagine small craft skimming ancient coasts with cargoes strapped to decks, sailors noting landmarks and masons boarding at dusk. A navigator keeps a secret instrument tucked beneath sailcloth, a simple frame for sighting a bearing. He trades stories with a carpenter who once cut timber along a far shore and a stonecutter who learned a slope rule from a visiting mason. These brief exchanges are the kind of low-bandwidth conversations that travel farther than treaties. Ports become classrooms and marketplaces become workshops, and the exchange of a single technique can travel in a crate beside copper and salt. The surveyor watches these marginal encounters as if they are evidence. He collects ledger entries and crew lists and treats them as field notes. Small gestures in a harbor can rewrite the pathways of craft across continents. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Trade routes run like arteries, carrying not just goods but procedures and the tacit knowledge needed to use them. An amphora listed in a customs ledger might share a manifest with a bundle of marked rods and slotted timbers. Merchants hire craftsmen for short seasons at foreign quays, and those craftsmen teach locally useful rules while they repair docks and set foundations. Ports are interim schools where measures are traded as currency. The surveyor reads manifests and notice entries that seem mundane until measures are compared and a module repeats. Timber, copper, and shaped blanks move between harbors, and craftsmen move with them, hired seasonally. A measuring stick in one ledger corresponds to a tally on a stone block elsewhere, and the coincidence invites inquiry. The presence of unfamiliar tools in port inventories suggests movement of craft knowledge rather than isolated invention. Witness accounts describe foreign masons teaching a sight line or a cord technique that local hands adopt. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Paleo shorelines changed the story of what was possible and who could meet whom on the water. Modern maps hide the ghost edges of ancient coasts defined by different sea levels and sediment patterns. The surveyor overlays older shoreline reconstructions on modern images and finds that many pyramid sites sit closer to coastlines that existed in earlier eras. Where a monument now sits inland, a shallow bay may once have lapped a landing place suitable for unloading stone and timber. Routes that seem implausible on contemporary charts snap into clarity when read against paleogeography. A shallow channel might have linked river mouths to sea lanes that allowed small cargo boats to slip inland. The shifting of sandbars and estuaries can render an ancient harbor invisible, but the alignment of nodes with old margins suggests a coastal logic to placement. Craftsmen could travel farther inland if the sea reached them then. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Human stories animate the sparse data and give texture to the motions of craft and measure. A navigator named only in a marginal note keeps a tiny sighting rod which he uses to fix a bearing on a coastal promontory and to teach apprentices how to carry a slope. He draws a small diagram in the margin of a ledger that survives and later matches a sketch found near an inland workshed. A mason remembers learning a slope rule after watching a stranger set a sight line along a beachfront platform. These anecdotes are fragile, passed by oral recollection or by quick scribble, but when dozens of them echo the same practical steps, the pattern becomes meaningful. They show how technique is taught in the absence of formal texts, conveyed by demonstration and by trusted instruments. The surveyor collects these vignettes and treats them as nodes of transmission rather than as local color. They form a human web that could have guided the spread of modules and proportions. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Material culture supports the tales and offers a physical record of mobility. Archaeological excavations reveal foreign timbers used as rollers, non-local copper alloys in tool caches, and small calibrated rods boxed among merchant cargo. A crate might contain a measuring stick with notches erased and renotched to fit a local module, evidence that instruments were adapted in new places. When such sticks are measured, they map back to modules found in stonework inland, suggesting portable standards traveling with people. The correspondence is not always perfect, and trade obfuscates origins. Yet the recurrence of specific tool types across distant ports argues for a network of practice. A timber species native to one coast appears in quarry refuse on a distant shore, proving movement of material. These archaeological signals smell of human hands and of itinerant expertise moving along routes of commerce. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Seasonality shapes the rhythm of exchange and imposes a cadence on the movement of crews and instruments. Builders and mariners planned for calmer months when rivers ran low and seas were gentler, and construction seasons followed predictable cycles tied to climate. Crews moved in windows when sandbars permitted landing, when river mouths were navigable, and when quarry teams were free. A master mason might sail during a particular month because that is when quarries could spare workers and coastal sand permitted unloading large blocks. These seasonal windows created regular opportunities for the transmission of knowledge, making routes repeatable and rhythms predictable. A visiting group of masons could train locals during a safe month and then return home before monsoon storms. This predictable pattern allows for the slow diffusion of techniques and the preservation of modules across generations. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Language complicates but also aids the spread of technique because tools and gestures can transcend tongues. Terminology for chord and slope shifts as languages change over coastlines, yet the physical demonstration of a sighting frame or the use of a notched rod can communicate a rule without words. Visual codes based on rods and chords function like a shared pigeon for builders. Even without common speech, craftsmen could teach a method by demonstrating a sighting frame, marking a block, and handing over a tool. The essence of the technique is embodied in gesture, in the feel of a rope pulled to a certain tension, or in the index finger set at a notch. The surveyor watches demonstrations and realizes that instruction often depends more on practice than on vocabulary, making the spread of a practical craft more likely than the spread of a written manual. Tools reproduce technique, instruments translate language. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. The team reconstructs hypothetical voyages using available coastal and wind data to test whether the proposed routes are feasible. They sketch routes that connect ports with similar modules and test whether prevailing winds and currents could support those voyages seasonally. Many of the suggested paths seem plausible when read against paleoclimatic models and reconstructions of ancient wind patterns. Shallow draft boats hugging coasts could avoid open ocean turbulence, and river mouths offered access deep into continents. The surveyor and a retired captain simulate loads and time windows, mapping where crews could feasibly move heavy tools and where supply depots could sit. The simulations do not prove movement happened, but they demonstrate practicality. If sea lanes could have supported this traffic, the Seedboat becomes a credible mechanism for transmission of measurement knowledge and craft habits. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Documentation is sparse and scattered, but marginalia and trivial records matter for reconstruction. A monastery ledger notes a foreign mason hired for one season. A customs register mentions rods among timber shipments, and a captain's diary records an instrument passed as payment. These fragments are later dismissed as administrative trivia until they are assembled and compared. The surveyor compiles such marginal notes and notices a repeating pattern. Instruments move with personnel, and personnel move along predictable routes. These traces form an archaeology of procedure rather than of monumental remains. When stitched together, they sketch a human geography of craft exchange that complements the physical evidence in stone. The archive yields small confirmations that, multiplied, become persuasive. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Not all exchanges are peaceful or neutral, and political dynamics play a role in the movement of specialist crews. A polity might hire foreign masons to erect a monument quickly, offering timber, food, and safe harbor in exchange for technical mastery. Competition for prestige can accelerate the adoption of foreign methods. Conflict and migration also act as vectors. War displaces populations along coastal corridors, and climate stress prompts communities to move, taking craft knowledge with them. The surveyor reads border accounts and trade disputes that reveal itinerant workshops seeking new patrons. These political forces can concentrate technique in hubs that then radiate influence outward. The role of power complicates the romantic image of voluntary craft transmission, but it also provides pragmatic explanations for how specialist knowledge could spread quickly and be retained in diverse polities. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. A fragmentary chart surfaces in the collections of a provincial archive and changes the tone of inquiry. It is a weathered scrap with a crude coastal sketch and notations of bearings between points. Scholars long dismissed it as decorative, yet when the surveyor overlays its lines on reconstructed paleo-coastlines, a faint alignment emerges linking a coastal node to an inland plateau with noted modules. The scrap includes tick marks matching notches seen on rods and stones elsewhere. The chart is not definitive proof, but it functions as a clue pointing to coordinated activity. It suggests someone once navigated and recorded bearings between specific nodes, a practice consistent with itinerant crews that needed orientation. The chart shifts speculation into a testable hypothesis and becomes a pivot for planning targeted excavation. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. The chapter closes with the sense that movement matters as much as design, and that craft is mobile in ways that change how we read monuments. The Seedboat is a model for transmission that fits the evidence in ways simple diffusion cannot. It accounts for shared modules and proportional signatures without invoking a single empire that built everywhere. Instead, it proposes a dispersed tradition of itinerant craftsmen, instruments, and seasonal voyages that transported technique across coastlines and into river valleys. The Seedboat reframes pyramids as nodes in a network connected by practical protocols and by human mobility. It does not resolve the mystery, but it yields testable predictions and points toward places where proof might be found. The next chapter will follow those traces into quarries and laboratories to see what the stones themselves will tell us. This detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures, this detail endures. Chapter 4: Material Memory. Unusual stones and shared techniques. From the lip of a quarry, the landscape reads like a ledger of choices. Laborers move with practiced rhythm and small gestures repeated across years and hands. At the exposed face, wedges bite and planes peel away, leaving parallel scars that record the sequence of extraction. The surveyor kneels and traces a tool mark with a fingertip and counts blows while noting direction and depth. He photographs grain and seam patterns and maps them into a field ledger that treats each bed as a record of method rather than merely a source of stone. Dust settles in discrete layers, preserving the order of work like pages of a ruined book. A quarry becomes a slow archive where recipes of cutting and lifting are written into the rock itself. Hands teach one another through touch and eye, and the marks left in stone outlast spoken instruction. When teams compare quarries across coasts, the same sequences of cuts appear as if copied from an invisible handbook. These shared processes suggest memory embodied in materials and practices rather than in grand monuments or single patrons. Labs hum with machines and the smell of reagents while tiny samples tell large stories. A fragment of mortar is reduced to powder and its chemistry opens a conversation across continents. Analysts find organic binders, plant resins, and unusual clays in mixtures that appear in multiple sites with no obvious trade link. Isotopic fingerprints and molecular traces point to similar recipes rather than random convergence. The surveyor watches a chromatogram and feels a thrill that is both scientific and narrative. Such shared binders suggest that masons carried formulas as they moved or that recipes traveled with traded goods. A legacy of technique might live in the mortar as surely as in a mason mark. Unexpected compounds appear in coastal platforms and in inland monuments alike, linking distant workshops. The lab results complicate neat national histories and hint at a material memory embedded in recipes and trade. Each powder sample becomes a line in the ledger of transmission and calls for more sampling. Transport is the practical heartbeat of monumental building, and techniques leave traces in surprising places. Rolling timbers, sledges, and shallow barges appear in iconography and in remnants on quays and riverbeds. A simple system of paired rollers alternated with cribbing shows up in rubble near quarries and also on river terraces. Some sites preserve grooves and polish tracks that match the wear patterns of wooden rollers and of ropes dragged in tow. Experimental teams reconstruct sled methods and find that wetting sand reduces friction by making grains slip more easily under heavy loads. Boats of shallow draft could carry blocks along coasts and up tidal rivers, then transfer loads to rollers for the last inland miles. The recurrence of these methods across regions points to practical knowledge adapted to diverse shorelines and soils. Archaeologists find remnants of roller staves and of chalked frames that match structural solutions used elsewhere. Transport technique is therefore neither local accident nor purely inventive flourish, but a set of reproducible practices. These practices form part of the material memory the team seeks to trace across the network. Quarrying is an art of fracture, and the methods used shape the available geometry of finished blocks. The plug and feather method of splitting bedrock leaves telltale holes and a characteristic arc of breakage. In multiple quarries, the surveyor finds the same spacing of drill holes and the same sequence of hammer strikes. Even where bedrock differs, the rhythm of extraction often mirrors a shared approach that minimizes energy and waste. Stone faces preserved for centuries show the same initial cuts and the same secondary dressing procedures. Tool marks on abandoned ledges match in spacing and depth across regions that otherwise have no direct link. Cutting grooves for levers and inserting splints appears as a repeated solution for detaching large sections. The consistency of these craft routines suggests a transmitted practice rather than repeated independent invention. Quarry plans and field sketches recovered from archives sometimes include standardized block dimensions corresponding to modules found on monuments. The quarry thus becomes a node in a network of practice where extraction technique is as meaningful as the stone itself. Mortar binds not only stone but also stories of trade and adaptation. Samples analyzed reveal organic additives like plant gums, crushed shell, and rare mineral powders that alter strength and setting time. Certain mixes include compounds that resist salt and humidity, suggesting knowledge of environmental behavior. Strange additives appear in far-flung places, a small percentage of recipe that shows up repeatedly. Isotope analysis sometimes ties an additive to a particular coastal ecology, implying long-distance sourcing. When a binder component traces back to a single geological formation, it suggests that material moved deliberately along routes. Binders can thus map trade in invisible ways, exposing linkages not apparent from pottery or coins. The team documents matching recipes in sites separated by thousands of miles and argues that mortar chemistry forms a chemical memory. This memory complements geometry and tool evidence because recipes are learned practical knowledge that travels with people. Understanding mortar becomes essential to reading the architecture as a networked product of shared craft. Tools carve the visible grammar of construction, and their composition records technological choices. Analysis of metal fragments reveals similar copper alloys used in chisels and adzes across disparate sites. Variation exists, but the presence of specific alloy recipes in multiple regions suggests knowledge of metallurgical tuning. Stone tools hardened by fire or tempering bear similar edge profiles and striking patterns. Toolkits found in dumps show combinations of items that recur like a carpenter's trusted set. These repeated tool assemblages point to a portable craft identity that a traveling team would recognize and reproduce. Metallurgy also links to trade because certain ores and smelting techniques are regional and therefore traceable. When metal composition matches across sites, it implies either trade in tools and ingots or the movement of smithing knowledge. The technical habits of smiths and masons become another layer of material memory that binds distant workshops. Tools thus act as carriers of practice and as forensic keys to reconstruct how skills moved. Choice explains anomalies when logistics make certain stones preferable despite distance. Some rocks possess qualities like density, weather resistance, or acoustic response that local materials cannot match. Masons might select distant stone for its predictable fracture or for a tonal quality useful in chambers. Trade networks could therefore prioritize these materials and accept complex transport costs in exchange for performance. The presence of such stone in a monument reveals trade priorities and technological expectations rather than purely aesthetic taste. When particular stone types reappear in nodes of the proposed network, they point to planned procurement strategies. Procurement implies knowledge of quarry locations, seasonal access, and reliable transport, all aspects of a functioning system. These logistical choices form a practical backbone for any network and explain why monuments cluster where they do. Understanding procurement strategies clarifies how shared technology could disseminate through markets and contracts. The stones carry not only mass but also decisions about what communities valued and how they organized supply. In one striking case, a distinctive igneous stone appears in two sites separated by a vast sea and in workshop refuse between them. Petrographic study reveals the same mineral mix and trace element signature that a geologist recognizes to a single formation. Isotope ratios in accessory minerals match those of a quarry belt documented in coastal records and in sailor logs. This match provides a chain of evidence linking quarry, shipping, and inland placement that moves beyond stylistic comparison. The discovery invites a reconstruction of the route and of the actors involved in procurement and building. When such a chain is found, it functions like a breadcrumb path that can be followed with test excavations and archive research. The case shows how material provenance can anchor the larger hypothesis by connecting points on the map through tangible goods. It makes the network visible in objects rather than only in geometry. The team plans targeted digs at intermediate ports and along proposed routes to search for more fragments and for workshop debris. Experimental archaeology becomes an instrument of proof when researchers attempt to reproduce ancient logistics. A team builds a sled, an array of rollers modeled on archaeological remains, and loads it with simulated blocks. They test methods on beach sands, on riverbanks, and on packed earth to discover how much manpower and water are required. Results reveal pragmatic adjustments that match where marks found at real sites, validating hypotheses about techniques. Wetting sand reduces drag dramatically, and cribbing solves elevation changes, while simple levers manage final positioning. Experiments also show failure modes that explain why some transport traces are absent or eroded in the archaeological record. Such practical tests bridge the gap between theory and capacity and demonstrate that the proposed techniques are feasible. The team documents parameters like crew size, seasonality, and tool durability, and compares these to historical records of maritime crews. By recreating the physical act of moving stone, they translate the material memory into working knowledge once again. Craftsmen move in webs of apprenticeship and work, and this mobility spreads method more than manuals do. Itinerant workshops travel with tools, partial templates, and the tacit knowledge of how to measure and assemble modules. A master mason might lead a compact team that can be hired seasonally to train local labor and set initial courses. These teams leave behind both techniques and small objects like marked rods and temporary gauges that become local standards. Records of hired artisans in administrative lists and payment rolls often coincide with building seasons at distant sites. Movement of people explains how subtle craft practices replicate across language boundaries and political divides. Itinerant teams also adapt to local materials while preserving signature methods that ensure interoperability of parts. This mobility creates a living chain linking quarries, ports, and finished monuments in practical workflows. Reading the traces left by traveling craftsmen reveals networks of labor that underpin monumental production. Material memory changes the terms of the argument about monumental origins and about what constitutes evidence. When mortar chemistry, transport traces, and tool metallurgy align across sites, the cumulative signal becomes hard to dismiss. This composite evidence suggests a distributed tradition of practice that can persist independently of political boundaries. It challenges narratives that treat monumental forms as purely local inventions and invites interdisciplinary collaboration instead. Geology, chemistry, ethnography, and archival research must join to follow the breadcrumb trails left in stone and in ledger. The implications touch on identity, trade, and the social organization of labor across time. They also demand humility because shared technique does not necessarily imply single authorship or identical purpose. Nevertheless, the material record offers a visible memory of how human beings solved engineering problems through exchange. Seen this way, pyramids become repositories of practiced knowledge as much as they are cultural statements. Tracing material memory invites targeted research and a new archaeology of craft transmission. The quarry faces the mortars, and the traces of movement compose a stubborn chorus that insists on explanation. Each sample tested and each transport experiment completed knits another thread into the fabric of a possible network. The surveyor keeps a list of unresolved puzzles, including a repeating quarry practice scene on islands and continents. He files requests for permits to excavate a remote coastal depot and coordinates with geologists and maritime historians. A small unexcavated mound sits on an island in the projected line, and its soil could contain discarded rollers or tool fragments. The team prepares to dig where the map before maps predicts a deposit of material memory might be found. This next effort will test whether quarry practice is an accidental echo or evidence of coordinated procurement and shared technique. The story is far from closed, and the next chapter will examine whether pyramids were engineered as systems or honored as shrines. The narrator promises more evidence and argues that material memory will be decisive if followed patiently and rigorously. The search continues, and the reader is asked to hold judgment until the stones themselves speak with greater clarity. Chapter 5: Ritual or Machine. Nightfall in a ruin reveals other voices. Where sunlight shows facades and corners, darkness reveals a skeleton of passages and cavities that seem to breathe. A team enters a corridor with lamps and steps, feeling air moving through stone like memory. They map shafts that cut through mass, narrow channels that climb and dip into the core, and small chambers tucked where no grave inventory has been recorded. These empty rooms hum with questions. Are they symbolic emptiness or purposeful hollows? Engineers approach with instruments while ritual scholars listen for stories in the silence. The surveyor runs a hand along a shaft and finds smoothing not consistent with hurried graves, but with repeated use. The team measures airflow, notes subtle pressure differences, and records temperatures that shift with predictable cycles. The architecture begins to appear less passive and more procedural, as if spaces were designed to move air, sound, or heat in specific ways across seasons, hours of the day. Sound behaves like a secret in stone. A graduate student taps a wall and listens for a pitch, then records a tone map that looks like a topography of frequency. In laboratory playback, the tones recur, matching notes produced in distant monuments despite different stone types and climates. Researchers devise tests using suspended bowls, water cups, and struck slabs to measure resonances and decay times. Chambers respond as if tuned to particular frequencies, amplifying certain ranges and dampening others. Such acoustic shaping could be used for signaling, for ritual amplification, or for engineering functions like pressure relief. When teams play recorded tones through reconstructed shafts, the resulting interference patterns alter airflow subtly in models, suggesting coupling between acoustics and ventilation. Local performative memories mention sustained humming during rituals that coincidentally emphasize the same resonant ranges across regions. Engineers modeled resonant coupling and found small pressure differentials sufficient to move air through narrow galleries, a measurable effect in scaled experiments reliably. Heat behaves like a slow signal in stone, arriving and leaving on its own timetable. Researchers measure thermal inertia in internal chambers and find diurnal cycles damped by mass. A small experiment places sensors in a passage and a shallow niche, recording temperature swings over weeks to model how stone moderates extremes. The data show that deep chambers fluctuated far less than outer faces, offering cool refuges in summer and retained warmth in winter. Engineers hypothesized that thermal buffering could support storage or rituals needing stable conditions. In one reconstructed model, a chamber oriented to a shaft receives heated air in a predictable pattern, creating convective loops. Such behavior depends on deliberate inlet and outlet geometry and on precise volumes and openings. When similar thermal profiles are recorded in distant monuments, the pattern suggests purposeful design rather than accidental hollowing. Thermal design becomes an engineering clue, a slow operating mechanism written in mass that communities tuned for environmental control and ritual. Light is an instrument when guided through stone. Teams study narrow shafts that aim at horizons, placing photometers to catch rays during equinoxes and solstices. In one experiment, a shaft channels dawn light into a deep chamber for a few minutes on a morning the team had nearly given up on. The beam moves across a carved surface and reveals a register of marks previously invisible. Such alignments could function as calendars, signaling seasonal events for coordination across nodes in a network. They could also mark times for specific operations, like coordinated loading or maintenance. Engineers model sightlines and find that small deviations in azimuth spoil the effect, which implies careful measurement in the original construction. When shafts in distant monuments show matching azimuthal intentions, the probability of shared practice increases. The intersection of light and stone becomes a practical timing device, a way to encode temporal knowledge directly into architecture and to synchronize activity across landscapes. Proof demands verification. Air moves like a quiet machinery through planned voids. Field teams measure pressure gradients between chambers and discover small but consistent flows determined by diurnal heating and by shaft geometry. In laboratory reconstruction, scaled models show that placing an inlet and outlet at particular heights produces predictable convection, drawing air through storage niches and clearing smoke during hearth use. The surveyor watches smoke tests where currents align with modeled predictions, confirming that architecture channels movement rather than leaving it to chance. Combined with acoustic coupling, these flows can be modulated by sound to enhance or reduce movement. Practical ventilation could preserve organic stores, enhance combustion for metalworking, or create conditions for delicate rituals needing clear air. The repeated presence of tuned inlets suggests builders understood the physics and applied it where needed. The argument is not that every hollow served identical ends, only that ventilation and air movement were important design considerations reflected consistently across sites in the proposed network. Some chambers hold traces of use not compatible with burial alone. Soil samples reveal residues of plant oils, traces of experimental pigments, and small metallic filings in places with no associated grave goods. Tiny pits in floors contain heated residue that lab tests match to specific metallurgical processes rather than funerary incense. The surveyor notes small benches and niches worn in repetitive patterns indicating repeated human occupation. These signs suggest workshops nested within monumental architecture where craft, testing, and controlled experiments might have occurred under sheltered conditions. An artisan could test a binding recipe in a protected niche. Such practices would leave chemical echoes and wear marks but not the grand tableau expected of a tomb. When similar residues appear in faraway chambers, the case for shared functional use grows stronger. The monuments reveal practical interiors sometimes hidden beneath ceremonial veneers, and the existence of workshops on-site reorients how we think about purpose and daily use. This changes core assumptions. Proof comes with trial and error, and the lab yields failures that teach as much as success. Teams build scaled models of passages, fit them with reed valves and tuned cavities, and run dozens of variations until patterns stabilize. At first, the models produce chaotic results, and the team questions whether they have misread the architecture. Sensors register noise and inconsistent flows. Failures force refinements. A slight chamfer here, a different inlet diameter there, a change in slope of a connecting gallery. One evening, a revised model finally shows a persistent convective loop when combined with an acoustic driver at a specific frequency. The loop moves small, lightweight objects across a gallery and produces measurable pressure oscillations at outlets. The moment is not dramatic like a machine turning on. It is a quiet validation that certain geometries and combinations of sound and heat can produce predictable movement. The team records parameters carefully, knowing replication across real sites will be required. Two sites speak in a terrifyingly similar voice. In one desert, a narrow chamber hides behind a blocked corridor, its ceiling subtly curved and smoothed to an uncommonly uniform radius. In a distant monument, a core chamber shares the same curvature, the same sequence of small notches along the ceiling where ropes or guides may once have been fixed. The surveyor compares scale drawings and finds the same minor offsets in ledges and in shaft profile. The coincidence is exact enough to rule out casual similarity and precise enough to demand explanation. When acoustic mapping is run on both chambers, they resonate at comparable modal frequencies, and when thermal sensors are placed in identical positions, the diurnal cycles match within expected local variance. These echoes across geography and culture point to a shared template or to itinerant teams carrying a specific chamber design. The match astonishes. Skeptics will raise the reasonable point of convergent solutions. Builders facing similar constraints often find similar answers. Ritual explanations remain powerful because monuments served sacred lives and social memory. Such perspectives challenge functional claims and demand high bars of proof. The research team acknowledges these critiques and tests them directly by modeling expected variance under independent invention scenarios. If independent invention explains the pattern, random distributions of proportions and internal features should appear when simulated across similar environmental constraints. Instead, the simulations, when fed with observed constraints, produce patterns less tightly clustered than what field data reveal. Statistical testing does not prove shared origins, but it lowers the probability that repeated chamber design and coupled acoustic and thermal behavior are purely coincidental. The result reframes debate from either-or to a graded question of influence, transmission, and adaptation. The team publishes methods openly because they know extraordinary claims need reproducible tests, and because replication is the only route to compelling resolution. Human stories anchor technical speculation, and the team seeks living parallels where craft survives. In one coastal village, an elder recalls a mason who tuned a chamber by ear, striking a stone and listening until the pitch pleased him. The elder mentions testing adhesives in sheltered niches and using hums to compact binders, a practice that aligns unexpectedly with lab findings. The surveyor records the recollection while noting how tacit knowledge persists. Craftsmen passing through ports may have preserved techniques in demonstration, and these performances sometimes encode precise functional steps. A traveling mason might have known how to set a notch sequence so ropes could brace forms during testing, or how to orient a shaft to deliver morning light at a specific hour. These small human acts scale into shared practice when repeated across crews. The narrative returns to the idea that ritual and function could coexist, and that craftsmen preserved both in living memory. Memory travels with tools often. If monuments served both sacred and functional purposes, social organization must be reconsidered. Construction crews would need coordination across seasons, not only to build but to operate and maintain systems that relied on timing and supply. Administrative records would therefore require logistical knowledge as much as ceremonial accounting. Communities might host itinerant specialists who trained local labor in operation, and seasonal rituals could double as maintenance and calibration events. Such a hybrid model reframes elite sponsorship not simply as patronage of memory, but as investment in operational infrastructure that delivered predictable outcomes like preserved stores or synchronized signaling. It complicates nationalist narratives because it suggests shared techniques and personnel crossed boundaries. Yet the team remains cautious, reminding listeners that practical functions do not erase ritual meanings. Instead, function and meaning could have been interwoven in ways that made both stronger and more resilient across generations. Coordinated calendars could time irrigation, harvest, and voyages, integrating temple rituals with practical cycles seasonally. The most compelling clue is surprisingly simple: an internal element repeated across distance and culture. In two pyramids separated by ocean and language, a small vaulted alcove sits at the same proportional depth from the summit, with entry thresholds cut to the same module. Each alcove bears a narrow lip at identical height and a shallow groove in the floor matching a carried template. Measurements show tolerances so tight the match resists casual coincidence. When this repeated feature is weighed against acoustic resonance, thermal buffering, shared modules, and transport traces, the cumulative pattern becomes hard to ignore. It suggests a craft tradition that replicated specific chamber designs across seas and into inland sites. Whether this implies a single originating school, itinerant workshops, or a dispersed techno-tradition remains open. The next chapter will follow the marks on blocks and rods to seek the hidden construction code that might explain how precise sharing occurred. Evidence will require more excavation and comparative study. Chapter 6: Lost Language, Hidden Measures. Reading the construction code. A code can be hidden in plain sight, lodged in the tiny marks that builders leave when they think no one watches. The search for a construction code begins not in great inscriptions but in marginalia, in repeated chisels and aligned notches that recur across sites. A linguist joins the team and trains eyes on tiny symbols carved into block edges, tally marks scratched behind corners, and repeating glyphic marks worn by hands. At first, the marks look like mason tags, ownership signs, or simple counters used for accounting. Gradually, patterns emerge, sequences that repeat with fidelity and positional logic. This early work reframes marginalia as syntax rather than idiosyncratic scrawl and asks whether measurement language survived in these small gestures. The linguist treats each notch as a token and each token as part of a larger grammar, translating physical marks into probable operations for measuring and dividing. The result is a slow decoding process that will feed other lines of evidence in the chapters to come. This finding requires further study. More field sampling will follow. Replication and transparency are essential. Independent testing must confirm proportional matches. Fragments of measuring rods and broken gauges turn up in unexpected places, shipwrecks and midden deposits with pottery shards scattered about. These rods are not uniformly marked, yet when measured they reveal a repeating internal logic of subdivisions and anchor notches. Some rods show a consistent primary unit divided into thirds and quarters, with secondary marks indicating offsets and tolerances. The team reconstructs working rods and uses them in field tests, aligning cord and frame against marks to reproduce slope ratios found on monuments. These practical experiments move the code from theory to embodiment, proving that a marked rod could teach a slope and partition a base with minimal verbal instruction. The rods function as portable standards and as mnemonic devices, enabling craftsmen to replicate proportions across distance. Instruments thus become carriers of code, and their survival in archaeological contexts becomes invaluable data for reconstruction. This discovery requires expanded sampling, replication, and rigorous cross-disciplinary testing to validate the code hypothesis across multiple independent sites. Pictorial templates and quick sketches expand the vocabulary of construction into a visual grammar. In archival fragments, the team finds diagrams showing base plans divided into measured modules, annotated with anchor marks identical to those on rods. Small sherds bear drawn triangles with internal braces, a shorthand for proportion and for transferring angles to stone. Such drawings could serve as teaching aids at a portside workshop or as working sketches for crews on arrival. The linguist reads these images as operational diagrams, not as symbolic art, a practical shorthand designed to communicate procedures at low overhead. When these templates match measured modules on monuments, the case strengthens, because visual templates can translate across languages and teach the eye how to subdivide space efficiently. More field sampling will follow. Replication and transparency are essential. Independent testing must confirm proportional matches. The team invites collaborative verification. A recurring sequence of marks coalesces into what the team calls a division syntax, a method for partitioning lengths into reliable fractions while controlling cumulative error. The syntax often uses a marked anchor followed by grouped notches where group size and spacing convey fractional parts. Redundancy marks appear at predictable intervals to allow cross-checking after erosion or mutilation. Such redundancy is an early form of error correction, demonstrating that builders anticipated physical degradation and designed resilience into their measurement system. This feature implies a pedagogical tradition with quality control and standardization practices, not ad hoc improvisation. The division syntax is therefore more like an engineering convention than a local habit, and it can travel with artisan groups as a portable method. Replication and transparency are essential. Independent testing must confirm proportional matches. Careful publication of raw data encourages replication. Different regions write the same code in dialects. Where one site uses simple dots to indicate a half, another uses short wedges, and yet both occupy the same functional position in a sequence. The linguist recognizes positional semantics rather than symbol identity. Location in the sequence matters more than graphic form. This discovery explains how the code could survive across literate and oral cultures, because it relies on order and position rather than on fixed glyphic shapes. It also suggests that Masons adapted the presentation of the code to local practices while preserving its underlying operational meaning. Thus, the construction code behaves like a language family with multiple scripts converging on the same grammar of measure. Further excavation and sampling will be prioritized. Cross-discipline methods will strengthen conclusions. Open datasets allow scrutiny by peers. Numbers can be embodied and instruments can do arithmetic by design. Apprentices could learn to subdivide by aligning chords with notches or by squaring templates against anchor marks instead of memorizing numerals. The team reconstructs training methods where apprentices practice repetitive gestures, matching rod notches with measured chord lengths until proficiency becomes muscle memory. This embodied arithmetic explains how measurement standards could persist in seafaring contexts where literacy and shared language were not guaranteed. Portable tools and demonstrative teaching make the code robust to linguistic fragmentation and allow a module to be reproduced precisely enough for interoperable construction. This finding requires expanded sampling replication and rigorous cross-disciplinary testing to validate the code hypothesis across multiple independent sites. The team invites collaborative verification. Careful publication of raw data encourages replication. A small anchor symbol appears persistently at the start of many sequences, a cross within a bounded mark or a paired notch that signals the base reference. The team labels this sign anchor because it functions as a datum from which partitions and slopes are measured. It is sometimes combined with orientation marks nearby indicating which face of a block should be set outward or inward. The anchor thus carries both metric and directional information, making it an efficient twofold signal for builders arriving in a new place. When the anchor appears on a rod in a coastal depot and on a block inland, the match suggests a network of practice where anchors oriented local measurements to a common standard. More field sampling will follow. Replication and transparency are essential. Independent testing must confirm proportional matches. The team invites collaborative verification. Advances in imaging reveal incisions invisible to the naked eye and resurrect erased marks. Raking light and infrared photography show faint incisions beneath layers of grime, and microscopic sampling reveals sequences of cuts made in a consistent order. Sometimes pigment remains trapped in grooves, and modern spectroscopy identifies mineral components matching palettes used in distant workshops. These technological methods extend the archive by recovering the code where erosion and later reuse had obscured it. By combining epigraphy and microanalysis, the team rebuilds sequences with a confidence that would have been impossible 2 decades earlier. Careful publication of raw data encourages replication. Further excavation and sampling will be prioritized. Cross-discipline methods will strengthen conclusions. The team considers human strategies to prevent drift and falsification of measures. Paired marks appear on opposing faces to allow cross-verification, and mirrored anchors on adjacent blocks ensure continuity across courses. Where erosion threatened identifiability, double notches and redundancy markers provided backups readable by sight or touch. These conventions point to an organized pedagogy taught by experienced masters who anticipated long-term decay and intergenerational transfer. It seems likely that itinerant masters audited local practices and corrected deviations, maintaining a living standard across vast distances. The social structures implied by such oversight align with payroll fragments documenting traveling specialists. Open datasets allow scrutiny by peers. Methodology must be shared for robust testing. Modern interventions complicate the record because reuse and restoration remove or alter marks. Many blocks were reshaped or repurposed in later centuries, and marginalia was often erased intentionally during remodeling. Restoration efforts in the 19th and 20th centuries sometimes recut surfaces and inadvertently destroyed measurement evidence seen by earlier observers. The team therefore works conservatively, relying on fragments and cross-comparisons and on stratigraphic contexts rather than on single altered faces. Despite these challenges, the underlying pattern of anchor symbols and division sequences persists strongly across independent samples when properly controlled for reuse and disturbance. The team invites collaborative verification, careful publication of raw data, encourages replication, further excavation, and sampling will be prioritized. The social life of the code appears in fragments of payrolls, guild lists, and oral descriptions of training visits. Payment records sometimes list master masons hired for short seasons, and bonus payments for precise work imply a premium on accuracy. Oral recollections preserved in coastal communities describe masters calibrating rods in public and teaching apprentices with demonstrations. Festival rituals involving temple maintenance may have doubled as calibration events where masters and locals synchronized measuring standards for the coming season. These social practices help explain how a measurement code could endure across generations despite political changes and linguistic shifts. Cross-discipline methods will strengthen conclusions. Open datasets allow scrutiny by peers. Methodology must be shared for robust testing. A recently unearthed block provides the most promising test because it bears a clear anchor symbol, partition marks, and traces of pigment matching samples from other sites. Stratigraphic context places the block in a sealed layer, and cross-dating and associated timber yields a plausible age window consistent with other network nodes. If replication confirms proportional matches and the internal sequence corresponds to division syntax, then the code moves from plausible hypothesis to testable model. The team prepares to publish raw data and invites independent replication because extraordinary claims require rigorous verification. The next chapter will examine the contested reception of these ideas among scholars and the political stakes of rewriting deep prehistory. Further excavation and sampling will be prioritized. Cross-discipline methods will strengthen conclusions. Open datasets allow scrutiny by peers. Chapter 7: Pushback: The Scholars, the Skeptics, and the Politics of Prehistory. Opportunity breeds suspicion, and scholars respond with cautious critique. News of the mapping and the suggested network spreads quickly through journals and into conference rooms where polite anger simmers. Senior academics insist that pattern recognition must not outrun secure stratigraphy and absolute dating. They point to the history of seductive overlays that coalesce random points into apparent systems and warn against premature grand narratives. Their demand is rigorous. Secure samples, multiple independent dates, stratigraphic control, and transparent methods. They argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that pattern must be tested by excavation rather than by cartographic imagination alone. The debate sharpens method and forces teams to prioritize context before synthesis. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. National narratives complicate scientific curiosity because monuments carry identity and pride, and because heritage is political. When a theory proposes shared traditions that cross modern borders, local authorities bristle at the suggestion that foundational myths might be part of a larger fabric. Ministers and museum directors consider how exhibitions will be framed and how school curricula would need rethinking if timelines shift. Funding agencies worry about tourism impacts, and heritage stakeholders worry about repatriation debates reignited by reinterpretation. Regional archaeologists argue for protecting national patrimony and for research designs that foreground local agency and symbolism. The research team needs to show sensitivity to identity and to work with ministries and communities to avoid appearing as outsiders rewriting history. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. The academic chorus fractures into methodological camps that shape the field and the pace of discovery. One camp pushes conservative excavation, insisting on stratigraphic control, secure dating, and in situ sampling before broad claims are advanced. This group values slow accumulation of evidence and warns against drawing global syntheses from remote sensing or pattern recognition alone. Another camp favors rapid interdisciplinary synthesis, arguing that geochemistry, remote sensing, and epigraphy together reveal emergent patterns invisible to single-discipline studies. The dispute is not merely about data, but about epistemology and about what kinds of evidence earn public trust. Conferences become arenas where protocols are argued over and where replication is demanded as the price of acceptance. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Skepticism can be constructive when it sharpens method and prevents error, and yet skepticism can harden into gatekeeping that slows progress. Established figures defending orthodox frameworks sometimes equate novelty with carelessness and raise the bar for new approaches beyond reason. Publication delays and restricted field permissions become instruments in disputes over interpretation, and younger researchers find their careers entangled in debates about access and authorship. The dispute becomes personal when reputations and institutional prestige are implicated. At the same time, the pressure of critique forces teams to publish methods openly, deposit raw data, and invite independent replication. In practice, the friction produces better work because methods must survive scrutiny and because transparent procedures reduce misunderstanding. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Practical barriers deepen scholarly disagreements because heritage law, ethics, and bureaucracy limit what researchers can sample and where they can dig. Excavation requires permits and consultation with descendant communities and ministries of culture. Where monuments are sacred or where tourism underpins local economies, officials sometimes restrict intrusive sampling or refuse the removal of material that could clarify construction sequences. Ethical obligations to protect human remains and to respect modern practices often mean the most revealing contexts remain off-limits. The team must design research that balances scientific goals with legal and ethical constraints, sometimes focusing on peripheral contexts or on non-invasive methods until permission is granted. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Media coverage amplifies scholarly fracture lines in ways that scientists cannot fully control. Popular outlets prefer tidy narratives and sensational claims, converting tentative probabilities into headlines that promise to rewrite textbooks. Social media compresses nuance into memes and punditry that amplifies controversy faster than peer review can respond. Institutions feel pressured to respond publicly, sometimes before careful replication is complete, and funding bodies react to headlines in ways that affect permit decisions and research agendas. Scientists learn that public communication is part of methodology and that engaging responsibly with media can protect the integrity of research. Managing expectations requires clear statements of uncertainty and visible commitments to open data. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Personal rivalries and institutional rivalries complicate interpretation because excavation and publication are tied to careers and to reputations built over decades. Expedition leaders who invested in particular frameworks resist reinterpretation that might undercut their life's work. Younger scholars pushing interdisciplinary syntheses sometimes confront closed networks that control permissions and publication venues. Disputes over authorship, analysis access, and priority of discovery can escalate in correspondence and social media, producing tensions that creep into peer review and funding decisions. Personal dynamics do not invalidate data, but they shape the social architecture of knowledge. Recognizing human motivations helps teams design governance, shared credit, and transparent collaboration to defuse personal conflict. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. A leaked lab result serves as a crucible when an early isotopic analysis circulates without context and before replication. The leak links quarry signatures and coastal deposits in a way that some interpret as supporting network procurement while others denunciation it as premature. Opponents seize the leak to accuse the team of confirmation bias and of inadequate peer review. Supporters insist the anomaly demands urgent follow-up, replication, and open data release. The leak forces laboratories to run audits and funders to convene independent panels to assess methods. It also highlights the importance of raw data publication and of secure data handling protocols. The episode accelerates transparency but also intensifies scrutiny, and the community learns to balance urgency with rigorous method. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Sometimes resistance is protective rather than obstructive, a reflex to guard patrimony and to prevent outside narratives from eclipsing local meanings. Regional scholars worry that claims of shared techno-traditions might flatten distinctive ritual practices and reduce complex local histories to interchangeable engineering nodes. Such concerns are valid because heritage shapes identity and because histories of external appropriation are painful and recent. The research team responds by foregrounding local voices, co-authoring reports with regional specialists, and designing exhibitions that emphasize local continuity alongside technological connections. Collaborative approaches reduce alienation and enrich interpretation by combining community knowledge with technical analysis. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Funding politics influence which questions are testable because grant agencies favor projects promising clear deliverables, capacity building, and conservation outcomes. Ambitious cross-continental network studies require larger budgets and complex partnerships, which increase administrative friction and delay field seasons. To be funded, such projects must include training programs, museum collaborations, and outreach budgets that meet local priorities. The team adapts by staging research in pilot phases that yield peer-reviewed results to justify expanded funding. This pragmatic choreography of small wins builds trust and opens the way for riskier investigations. Funding constraints thus shape methodology and timelines, sometimes conservatively and sometimes productively. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Policy and public interest intersect with scholarship in ways that shape museum narratives, permits, and national education. When ministers sense that new interpretations might disrupt tourism or identity policies, they can influence which permits are granted and which exhibits are promoted. Conversely, public fascination with dramatic reinterpretations can generate funding and political will to support further excavation. The research team mitigates political pressure by inviting policymakers to transparent briefings, by demonstrating methods in field workshops, and by producing balanced public materials that convey uncertainty alongside findings. This engagement reduces misunderstandings and fosters informed decisions about heritage management. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Paradoxically, the controversy often strengthens the research by forcing higher standards and broader collaboration. Scrutiny requires larger sample sizes, standardized protocols, reproducible methods, and open data. Laboratories in multiple countries run blind tests, and interdisciplinary workshops develop agreed methodological handbooks. Where gatekeeping once limited replication, collaborative consortia form with transparent governance and shared credit arrangements. Field seasons become multinational and cross-institutional, and pooled expertise enables more robust testing of the network hypothesis. The work becomes slower but more resilient to criticism, and where consensus emerges, it carries unusual strength because it survived rigorous challenge. The team documents everything for the record. Data is archived openly. Colleagues are invited to replicate findings. Protocols are published online for scrutiny. Independent labs are encouraged to test samples. Methods are clarified and shared. Chapter 8: The Global Mechanism, a Working Model. At last, the hypothesis can be assembled like a machine, each piece tested and put in place. The team gathers in a makeshift lab under shadecloth and projects maps, isotopic charts, acoustic models, and ledger transcriptions onto a single wall. They talk in terms of nodes and edges, of supply depots and sightlines, of seasonal windows and crew sizes. An engineer sketches a schematic that treats pyramids as functional nodes within a larger system. Coastal platforms for receiving materials, river hubs for inland transfer, calibration monuments that set anchors, and interior chambers tuned for storage, testing, and coordination. The model must integrate movement, material, measurement, and meaning. It must be flexible enough to cover regional variation yet strict enough to make testable predictions. The team argues late into the night, rearranging ideas into modules and runs simulations that will either let the model breathe or break. This is the moment the separate clues begin to speak in a common language. The reconstructed network relies on seasonal logistics and predictable rhythms. The team models annual cycles of sea and river navigation, quarry release schedules, and agricultural downtime when labor could be mobilized. They imagine small fleets running along paleo coastlines during calm months, offloading blocks at estuary depots where rollers and sledges carried stone inland. Crews work in cyclical pulses: quarrying, transport, setting foundations, and maintenance. The model predicts windows when calm seas align with slack labor and when river mouths are navigable by shallow draft boats. Agent-based runs test permutations of crew sizes and timing to find feasible throughput rates so a depot could supply inland teams without catastrophic bottlenecks. Seasonal rhythm becomes a crucial constraint and a synchronizing force for nodes across the network, enabling the predictable movement of instruments and standards. Geometry and coded measures act as protocols akin to engineering standards in the model. The model treats anchors and division syntax as interoperable protocols, allowing different crews to operate compatibly. A marked rod serves as a portable reference, a standard that, once understood, lets builders partition a base and replicate slope decisions without shared language. Simulations test whether small variations in local units could be normalized by anchor reference and redundant marks. Results show that a protocol with redundancy and mirrored anchors dramatically lowers cumulative error across linked construction stages. The model therefore depends on a practical standardization mechanism that is portable and resilient to erosion and to changes in local vocabulary. Protocols propagate stability and interoperability across distant workshops and seasons. Material provenance forms the supply backbone of the working model and is treated as traceable flow between nodes. Isotopic links between coastal quarries, mapped depots, and inland monuments create supply chains the simulations can follow. The team runs agent-based logistics that move virtual blocks along seasonal rules, testing for bottlenecks and failure points. When simulations incorporate paleo-shoreline reconstructions and known small port capacities, the predicted routes align with archaeological finds like roller fragments, workshop debris, and exotic timber remains. The model also explores alternatives. Whether some nodes acted primarily as calibration platforms rather than procurement centers, explaining variation in exotic stone presence. Material flow thereby anchors abstract geometry in the physical reality of procurement and transport and makes testable predictions about deposits along routes. The functional layer of the model assembles plausible roles monuments might play beyond memorialization. The model enumerates functions, calibrated storage for seed or material, timing devices synchronized by light shafts and acoustic cues, signaling nodes for coastal navigation and inland coordination, and microclimatic regulators preserving perishables or craft materials. Each function requires design features the team cataloged: calibrated chambers, tuned resonances, thermal buffering, oriented shafts, and controlled inlets and outlets. The model evaluates which combination of features best explains observed anomalies at each node. Some pyramids score high as combined timing and calibration centers. Others register more strongly as storage hubs. The model therefore allows heterogeneous functions while preserving network coherence through shared measurement and maintenance practices. Testing the model requires field experiments and targeted excavation guided by predictions. If a node functioned as a depot, the model predicts concentrated workshop debris, roller remnants, and varied toolkits in peripheral contexts rather than only in monument cores. If anchors were audited periodically, one expects calibration caches, small deposits of marked pegs, rod fragments or anchors in service layers. Acoustic and thermal predictions pinpoint where sensors should record characteristic frequencies or convective loops. The team prioritizes sites where multiple independent model outputs converge and designs minimally invasive tests to check for predicted residues. The experiment-first strategy reduces interpretive leaps by letting model outcomes dictate field priorities and by requiring negative results to falsify model components. Simulations reveal emergent vulnerabilities that help explain long-standing anomalies. For example, a node that appears isolated in modern reconstructions aligns with a now-buried seasonal river mouth in paleo-coastline models. The simulation shows such a node would have been accessible during specific windows, making its location sensible. Where a monument lacks exotic stone, the model shows it could still function as a calibration site or relay rather than as a procurement terminus. The model also accounts for redundancy. Clustered monuments with similar modules provide fail-safes for calibration and maintenance and reduce single-point failures. Understanding vulnerabilities helps explain why certain nodes were fortified and why some nodes disappear from the archaeological record after shifts in sea level or political economy. Calibration and quality control are central concepts in the working model because small errors amplify across networks. The model posits periodic audits by itinerant masters who recalibrate anchors, replace worn rods, and correct local drift. These audits could be tied to seasonal gatherings or festivals that function as both social reinforcement and technical maintenance. The model tests the effect of audit frequency on network stability and finds that regular calibration reduces cumulative displacement and maintains interoperable modules across generations. Redundancy marks and mirrored anchors act as passive error checking and support in the event of master absence. The model therefore depends not only on standards but on governance mechanisms to enforce and transmit them across wide geographies. Political economy integrates into the model because construction and operation require resources and institutional support. Simulations incorporate resource allocation, crew remuneration, and contract-like arrangements where city-states or elites financed itinerant teams for seasonal projects. The model maps how prestige, tribute, and trade underwrite logistical costs and how patronage networks could incentivize knowledge sharing or hoarding. Competition emerges as a factor. Rival polities could hire masters to secure advantage or to appropriate standards, producing diffusion through prestige as well as market exchange. The political layer helps explain why the network sometimes overlaps with centers of administrative control and why some hubs concentrate technical expertise and training. The team tests alternative explanations rigorously to avoid confirmation bias. They run null models of independent invention, random site clustering, and climate-constrained convergent solutions to see whether the observed concentration of microfeatures exceeds expected variance. Statistical approaches compare observed clustering of modules, anchors, and tool marks against distributions generated by independent invention under realistic constraints. In many cases, the network model outperforms null models by producing tighter clustering of specific microfeatures like notch spacing and mirrored anchors, and by predicting co-occurrence of material and functional traces in predicted depots. Null testing sharpens the model and clarifies which predictions are robust and which remain tentative. Field tests begin to deliver convergent evidence that supports parts of the model. Excavations at predicted depot sites reveal concentrated workshop debris, including foreign timber species and marked rod fragments. Mortar chemistry links back to coastal quarries. Caches of pegs and anchor fragments appear in service layers consistent with periodic calibration events. Acoustic sensors placed in reconstructed shafts reproduce resonant patterns predicted by the model, and thermal mapping confirms convective behavior in chambers at predicted rates. Agent-based simulations retrofitted with field results produce tighter route predictions and highlight intermediate sites where further evidence should be sought. Convergence does not equal proof, but the accumulation of independent lines in predicted places increases confidence. The final promise of a working model is epistemic. It turns a collection of anomalies into a coherent research program that is falsifiable, replicable, and generative of new data. Rather than forcing a total rewrite of history, the model supplies a framework that integrates geometry, material traces, functional design, and human mobility into testable propositions. It allows scholars to ask targeted questions, to prioritize excavation strategically, and to evaluate competing narratives within a common methodological space. The model invites collaboration across geology, archaeology, ethnography, acoustics, and maritime history because each domain can contribute decisive tests. If the model holds in more cases, it will reshape how monuments are read, not as isolated wonders, but as nodes in engineered social systems. Chapter 9: The Proof That Could Rewrite Everything. The story reaches its climax in the desert silence. Here, where shifting sands bury and reveal in equal measure, the searchers uncover what could be the key to everything. It is not a grand monument, but something far smaller, a fragment that speaks louder than towering stone. Hidden within a forgotten chamber, carved in weathered relief, lies a map. Not a map in the modern sense, but a geometric sketch, etched with ratios and angles that unmistakably align pyramids oceans apart. The air feels heavy as the implications settle. If authentic, this is no random carving. It is a record of intent. It whispers that the builders, from Giza to Teotihuacan to the banks of the Ganges, were following a single guiding standard. The hypothesis once spoken in hushed tones now takes shape as a tangible artifact, something no critic can easily dismiss. The silent walls seem to ask, how long has this truth been waiting? Skeptics circle like vultures, their questions sharp. They demand provenance, context, explanation. Could the carving be a coincidence? Could erosion have shaped the lines? The researchers resist the urge for easy answers. They bring in specialists, geologists to study the tool marks, mathematicians to compare the ratios, historians to cross-check parallels. Each test seems to push doubt further into a corner. The geometry holds firm, refusing to be erased by skepticism. A faint layer of mineral deposits suggests antiquity older than dynasties, older even than the pharaohs who claimed eternal power. The critics falter but do not fall silent. They remind the world that evidence is fragile and interpretation dangerous. Yet the image remains, etched into stone, quietly declaring its defiance of simple explanations. If true, it ties together the world in ways history has never admitted. If false, it remains the most tantalizing mirage ever carved. The narrative shifts back to the human scale, to the lone surveyor who first noticed the alignments years earlier. He walks the chamber, eyes fixed on the carving, and feels vindication mingled with awe. The detective trail of maps, measures, and quarries has led here. The stories of masons, traders, and seafarers are no longer speculation, but a thread woven into stone. He recalls the faint alignment from the very beginning, that tiny clue dismissed as coincidence, now revealed as part of a greater whole. Emotion surges. This is no longer a matter of dusty charts or abstract ratios. It is a living confrontation with the possibility that a forgotten civilization stitched the earth together. The chamber becomes a theater where past and present collide. The carving is both artifact and testimony, a voice from an age erased. And for the first time, the radical hypothesis feels less like theory and more like inevitability. But inevitability does not mean acceptance. Outside the chamber, the debate intensifies. Governments stake claims. Museums jostle for custody. Academics draft papers while others rush to suppress them. The artifact is scanned, copied, and debated across continents. Meanwhile, whispers of conspiracy grow. Some say it proves an advanced civilization lost to time. Others warn of modern forgery planted to stir chaos. The truth is fragile, balanced between discovery and dismissal. Yet the artifact itself does not change. Its lines remain steady, immune to human squabbles. They cut across the noise like the pyramids themselves, silent and enduring. In the end, the fight over interpretation reveals more about modern humanity than the builders. Pride, fear, and ambition clash over an ancient riddle. The carving waits, patient, as it always has, its message indifferent to the storms of men. Only those willing to listen carefully can hear what it truly says. To understand the full weight, one must trace back through the threads that led here. The shared geometry across continents, the repeated slope ratios, the fingerprints of trigonometry hidden in stone. The seafaring legends, the maps etched in memory, the instruments carried across waves. The quarries that spoke the same language in distant lands, the mortar that bound blocks oceans apart. The rituals that hinted at mechanical purpose, the chambers that behaved like machines rather than tombs, the secret measures encoded in art, the symbols that repeated from script to script. All those fragments now converge. In this chamber, on this wall, they fuse into one undeniable image. The carving is not proof of purpose, but proof of connection. It whispers of a network older than nations, wider than empires. For those who dare believe, it is the missing page of prehistory, the one written in stone and hidden for millennia. And yet, belief is not enough. The scientific method demands patience, evidence, verification. The team begins the slow grind of analysis, publishing findings, opening the chamber to wider inspection. Technology joins the hunt. Lasers map the carving with microscopic precision. Algorithms test its alignments against known sites. Each result tightens the net, confirming the improbability of chance. But skeptics remain, pointing to gaps in dating, to missing context, to dangers of overreach. The debate grows louder, spilling into media and politics. The carving becomes more than archaeology. It becomes a mirror of humanity's hunger for origin stories. For some, it is hope of unity. For others, it is a threat to carefully guarded histories. In the storm of opinions, one thing is clear. The carving refuses to disappear into obscurity. It demands attention, and in doing so, forces history itself to bend, however slightly, toward reconsideration. The drama peaks when a hidden detail emerges. Buried within the carving's geometry is a small set of marks, barely visible, etched like annotations. When magnified, they resemble not random scratches but measurement codes. Ratios too precise to be accidental. They match the very standards tracked in earlier chapters, the same hidden measures found across scripts and blocks. The realization hits with the force of revelation. This is not only a map, but a manual, a set of instructions portable across time and space. The lost recipe book, once theorized, now glimpsed. If true, it means the carving is not symbolic but practical, a fragment of the builder's engineering handbook. It bridges the gap between speculation and function. The skeptics reel, the believers surge, and the debate sharpens. What began as lines in stone now unfolds as evidence of a shared technology, as real as any hammer or chisel. In the wake of this revelation, the world begins to look different. Coastlines once dismissed as random settlement patterns appear as deliberate staging points. Trade routes long assumed to be isolated suddenly form part of a grid. Even the placement of forgotten ruins takes on new meaning. Scholars who once laughed now pause, considering. What if history has been missing not just a chapter but an entire book? What if pyramids were not isolated monuments but terminals in a system beyond comprehension? The carving seems to suggest it, yet the human mind struggles with such scope. To accept it means rewriting not only timelines but assumptions about civilization itself. It means accepting that the roots of engineering, navigation, and geometry reach deeper than any empire we know. The pyramids stop being ancient wonders alone. They become coordinates on a map too vast for easy comprehension. The mystery sharpens rather than resolves. The story returns to those who risked their careers on the radical hypothesis. Their faces bear the strain of skepticism endured, of ridicule weathered, of nights spent poring over ratios and quarries. In the chamber, they stand before the carving in silence. It is no longer just an object of study. It is vindication and yet also burden. For with proof comes responsibility. To show the world without distortion. To resist the temptation of fantasy. To honor the builders whose work has been misread for millennia. The weight is immense, but so is the wonder. They know that history will never look the same again. Whether the world accepts or rejects, they have touched a truth buried deeper than stone. The carving speaks not only of ancient knowledge but of human persistence, of questions that refuse to die, of mysteries that demand the courage to keep asking no matter the cost. As the world digests the carving, new expeditions launch. Researchers return to sites once dismissed as insignificant. Technologies once reserved for industry are turned on ruins. Patterns emerge faster now, accelerated by the lens of the carving. Lines converge, connections multiply, and the sense of a global system strengthens. The narrative of isolated civilizations begins to wobble. Younger minds, less chained by orthodoxy, embrace the challenge. The idea spreads beyond academia into the public imagination. A new story of prehistory takes root, fragile but resilient. It is not a story of domination but of connection, not of kings but of builders. And at its heart are the pyramids, those eternal witnesses who kept their silence until we were ready to listen. The carving becomes a symbol, not only of what was lost but of what remains possible. a reminder that the past still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. In the end, the proof is not final but enough to change everything. Enough to force new questions, enough to shake the foundations of certainty. The carving does not tell us exactly who built the pyramids, or why, or how they spread across oceans, but it tells us they were connected, that they were more than tombs or temples, that they were part of something larger, older, and more deliberate. The radical hypothesis, once dismissed as fantasy, now stands on firmer ground. The debate will rage on, but history has shifted. A door has opened, and behind it lies an ocean of possibilities. The search continues because one carving cannot tell the whole story, but it tells enough to make clear that we have been looking at the world through too narrow a lens. The pyramids are not just monuments of stone. They are messages in code, waiting for us to finally listen. The chapter closes not with certainty but with promise. The carving is not an ending but a beginning. It forces us to admit how much we do not know and how much we still might uncover. It unites the threads of geometry, seafaring, material science, ritual, and code into one undeniable question. Who were the builders, and what world did they truly inhabit? The answer is not yet in our grasp, but the proof ensures we can no longer ignore the possibility. History must bend, timelines must stretch, and imagination must expand. The pyramids will never look the same again. Neither will we. The chamber falls silent, the carving waiting, patient as ever. The searchers leave, but the story does not end. Somewhere in the shadows of time, more truths lie waiting, buried beneath stone and sea. And when they surface, history will be rewritten once more.